What happens when a billionaire CEO, a man who built an empire on words, tries to use a secret language to mock the one person he should have never underestimated in the gilded cage of a Michelin star restaurant? CEO Elias Vance whispered venom about the unassuming waitress serving his table, believing she was beneath his notice. He didn't know he was speaking to a ghost from a past he had buried. He didn't know that, with a few perfectly chosen words, she was about to unleash a truth that would shatter the silence, break his engagement, and expose the devastating lie that could destroy his entire empire. This isn't just a story of a waitress getting revenge. It's the story of how a single voice, armed with the truth, can bring down a king. The air inside Ethelgard's was different. It wasn't just filtered. It felt refined, as if the very oxygen molecules had been polished before being permitted to enter. Crystal glasses so thin they seemed to hum with tension stood like a platoon of soldiers on tables draped in white linen thick enough to muffle a scream. The clientele, a curated collection of old money and audacious new wealth, spoke in hushed, confident tones, their laughter as carefully modulated as the soft jazz trio playing in the corner. For Clara Hayes, the air was just recycled and stuffy. At 26, she moved through this opulent theatre with a practiced grace that belied the exhaustion settling deep in her bones. Each step was precise, each smile a carefully calibrated mask. She was a ghost in a black and white uniform, refilling water glasses that were already 3/4 full and clearing away plates bearing more garnish than sustenance. Most nights she was invisible, and she preferred it that way. Invisibility was a shield. It allowed her to observe, to listen, and to retreat into the intricate world of her own mind, a world where she wasn't just a waitress with an ever-growing pile of medical bills for her younger sister Lily. In that world, she was the person she was supposed to be. Clara Hayes' first-class honours in comparative literature and linguistics from Cambridge, a woman who could deconstruct a sentence in 5 languages and find the soul of a story in a single word. But reality was a cruel editor. A car crash 2 years ago had stolen her parents and left her with Lily, a mountain of debt, and a future rewritten in the stark, unforgiving ink of necessity. So she served amuse-bouche to people who spent more on a bottle of wine than she earned in a month, and she saved every dollar for Lily's next round of physical therapy. Tonight, the centerpiece of the restaurant's main dining room was Table 7, a prime spot with a panoramic view of the city's glittering skyline. It was occupied by the man whose face was plastered across every business magazine that month, Elias Vance. Elias was the CEO of Vance & Sterling, publishing a titan of the literary world. He hadn't just inherited the company, he had transformed it aggressively, acquiring smaller presses and gambling on controversial authors. He was hailed as a visionary, a kingmaker. He was handsome in a severe, sculpted way, with dark hair swept back from his forehead and eyes the color of a winter storm. He radiated an aura of restless, predatory energy. With him were 2 others. His fiancée, Catherine Davenport, a statuesque blonde whose family owned half the city's commercial real estate, wore a diamond necklace that seemed to steal the light from the room. She listened to Elias with an adoring, almost vacant expression. The third was Julian Croft, Elias's second-in-command. He was quieter, more observant, his eyes constantly scanning the room, taking in details with a nervous energy that contrasted with Elias's unshakable self-assurance. Clara was assigned their section. Her stomach tightened. High-profile tables could mean a generous tip, but they often came with a commensurate level of entitlement. "Good evening," she said, her voice calm and professional as she approached. My name is Clara, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. May I start you with some water, still or sparkling?" Elias didn't even look at her. He was in the middle of a story, his hand gesturing grandly. So I told him the manuscript is either on my desk by Monday, or he can find someone else to publish his drivel. The market waits for no one. Catherine laughed, a tinkling sound, like ice in a glass. "Darling, you're so ruthless." "It's not ruthlessness, my love. It's clarity," he corrected, finally turning his gaze to Clara. It wasn't a look of acknowledgement, but of assessment, as if she were a piece of furniture that had just spoken. He scanned her simple uniform, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a flicker of something amusement, or perhaps contempt, crossed his face. "Sparkling," he clipped, dismissing her. "And a bottle of the 98 Cheval Blanc." "An excellent choice, sir," Clara replied, maintaining her composure. As she turned to leave, she heard him lean in towards Catherine and Julian, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. He switched to what he believed was a private channel, a language he assumed a simple waitress would never comprehend. He began speaking in what he thought was perfect cultured German, but Clara's mind, trained and sharp, immediately picked up on the nuances. His accent was clumsy, the grammar slightly off the confident speech of a man used to being understood through power, not precision. But it was the words themselves that made her freeze her back still to the table. He was speaking in English, but with the cadence and assumption of it being a foreign tongue. "Look at her," he said, the words laced with a casual cruelty. "You can just see the crushing weight of mediocrity. Probably has a couple of cats and a mountain of student debt for a degree in something utterly useless. The walking embodiment of wasted potential." Julian shifted uncomfortably. "Elias, come on." "What, it's true?" Elias continued a smirk in his voice. "This is what happens when people don't have ambition. They orbit greatness, but they never touch it. They just pour the water." Catherine giggled. "You're terrible." Clara stood perfectly still beside the sommelier station, her hand gripping the edge of the marble counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Every condescending syllable landed like a physical blow. Crushing weight of mediocrity, useless degree, wasted potential. He had, with a few careless words, stripped her down to her deepest insecurities. He saw her not as a person, but as a symbol of failure, a prop in the grand play of his success. A hot, familiar shame washed over her, followed by a surge of icy fury. For 2 years she had swallowed her pride. She had smiled through condescension and endured the pitying glances. She had served men like Elias Vance, erasing herself so that they could feel more like kings. But something inside her snapped. It was the casual, unthinking cruelty of it, the assumption that she was deaf, dumb, and stupid simply because she was wearing an apron. She took a deep, steadying breath, the polished air suddenly feeling thin and sharp in her lungs. She picked up the ridiculously expensive bottle of wine and the water. As she walked back to the table, her steps were no longer the silent tread of a servant. They were deliberate, measured, and firm. She had a choice. She could ignore it, pour the wine, and let the comment fade into the ambient clatter of the restaurant, just another small humiliation in a life that had recently been full of them. Or she could pick up the gauntlet he had so arrogantly thrown down. The ghost in the uniform was about to speak, and she would not be using the simple deferential script he expected. Clara approached the table, her expression a perfect mask of serene professionalism. Inside her heart was a trapped bird beating frantically against her ribs. She placed the silver bucket with the Cheval Blanc beside the table, her movements fluid and economical. Elias Vance didn't spare her a glance, continuing his monologue about a hostile takeover of a rival publishing house. She uncorked the sparkling water, first pouring a glass for Catherine, then Julian, and finally Elias. Her hand was steady, a small victory in the face of her inner turmoil. As I was saying, Elias declared, waving a dismissive hand, the old guard is terrified of change. They cling to their dusty traditions while the world moves on. Publishing isn't about sentiment. It's about selling a narrative. My narrative. He paused, a self-satisfied smile playing on his lips, and gestured towards his wine glass. It was the moment. Clara picked up the heavy bottle of Saint-Emilion wine, the dark red liquid sloshing gently within. "Sir, you were discussing the weight of mediocrity." She began her voice, perfectly even, but with a new, crystalline clarity that cut through the restaurant's murmur. The conversation at table 7 stopped dead. 3 pairs of eyes snapped towards her. Elias's face, which had been animated and imperious, froze. A flicker of confusion, then irritation crossed his features. Clara continued, not looking at him directly, but at a point just over his shoulder, as if addressing the room itself. She spoke in flawless, eloquent English, her diction crisp and academic, mirroring the very structure of the language he had just used to mock her. It is a fascinating philosophical concept, she said, her voice never rising yet commanding the space around them. The idea that potential can be wasted implies a predetermined purpose. But who is the arbiter of that purpose? Is it the individual living a life of quiet integrity under difficult circumstances, or is it the observer who measures worth only by wealth and public acclaim? Julian Croft's jaw had gone slack. Catherine Davenport stared, her perfectly painted lips slightly parted in disbelief. Elias's eyes narrowed, the storm clouds gathering. He was beginning to understand. Clara moved to present the wine, holding the bottle so the label was perfectly visible to him. You also mentioned a useless degree, a compelling thought. I, for instance, hold a first in comparative literature from Cambridge. One of the topics of my dissertation was the semiotics of power in postmodern German literature. It's a field that explores how language is used, not just to communicate, but to establish dominance, to categorize, and to dehumanize. She paused, letting the words hang in the now silent air around the table. As in, for example, a man of status, assuming a service worker is uneducated and proceeding to mock her in a language he presumes she can't understand. A classic, if somewhat clumsy, exertion of perceived superiority. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Elias Vance, a man who built his empire on the power of words, was utterly speechless. A dull, angry red was creeping up his neck. He had been exposed, his petty cruelty laid bare on the starched white linen between the bread basket and the butter dish. With surgical precision, she opened the wine, the pop of the cork unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. She poured a small amount into Elias's glass for him to taste. He stared at it, his hand unmoving. Or perhaps, she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet each word a perfectly sharpened dart. You'd prefer I comment on your grammar instead? It's passable for a tourist, I suppose. But for a publisher, one would expect a better grasp of the subjunctive mood. Julian Croft choked back a sound that was half cough, half laugh, quickly trying to disguise it by taking a sudden, desperate gulp of water. Catherine's face was a mask of horrified embarrassment. This was not part of the script of her perfect, curated life. Elias finally found his voice. It was a low, guttural snarl. "Who in the hell do you think you are? My name is Clara," she said simply, placing the bottle on the table. "And I'm your waitress." She met his furious gaze for the first time. There was no fear in her eyes, only a calm, unassailable dignity. In that moment, the power dynamic had inverted so completely it was almost dizzying. She was no longer the invisible servant. She was the one in control. "Now," she said, her professional mask slipping back into place. "If you'll excuse me, I believe the chef is ready to send out your appetizers." She turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps measured. She didn't look back, but she could feel the scorch of his glare following her. She could feel the shattered pieces of his arrogance littering the floor around table 7. As she pushed through the swinging doors into the hot, chaotic sanctuary of the kitchen, she finally allowed herself to tremble. Her small act of defiance had felt like detonating a bomb, and she had no idea what the fallout would be. But as she leaned against the cool, stainless steel of the counter, a single unexpected thought cut through the adrenaline. During his earlier tirade, Elias had mentioned his own upcoming project, a book he was personally championing. He had named it The Crimson Labyrinth. The name echoed in her memory, plucking a string of unease that had nothing to do with his insults. She had heard that title before. Years ago, in a quiet, dusty university office, spoken by a man with kind eyes and a passion for forgotten stories. A man who was now dead. Suddenly the confrontation wasn't just about a moment of humiliation. It was about something far, far darker. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of forced composure. Clara performed her duties with robotic efficiency, avoiding table 7 as much as possible, leaving another waiter to handle their main course and dessert. She could feel the tension radiating from their corner of the room. Elias spoke in low, angry tones, while Catherine tried in vain to smooth things over. Julian remained conspicuously silent, occasionally glancing towards the kitchen doors with a look Clara couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't anger. It was calculation. When they finally left, Elias made a point of striding past her station, near the front, his eyes burning with a cold fire that promised retribution. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The message was clear. This isn't over. The ride home on the later night bus was a fog of anxiety and adrenaline. The satisfaction of her defiance was quickly being replaced by the cold dread of its consequences. She'd almost certainly be fired. Mr. Dubois, the restaurant manager, was a stickler for protocol, and intellectually vivisecting a VIP guest wasn't in the employee handbook. How would she pay for Lily's next round of treatments? But beneath the fear, the name of that book churned in her mind. The Crimson Labyrinth. She let herself into her small second-floor apartment, the air thick with the scent of lavender from the diffuser she kept by Lily's bed. Her sister was asleep, her breathing soft, and even one hand clutching the worn teddy bear she'd had since she was a baby. A wave of fierce protective love washed over Clara, momentarily silencing her own panic. This was why she endured it all. For Lily. After checking on her, Clara went to the cramped corner of the living room that served as her office. She booted up her old slow laptop, the fan whirring to life with a pathetic groan. She navigated to the archived folders of her university email account, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She typed a name into the search bar, Alistair Finch. Professor Alistair Finch had been her mentor at Cambridge, a brilliant, gentle soul with a rumpled tweed jacket and a mind like a library of forgotten lore. He had been the one who nurtured her love for linguistics, who saw past her shyness to the sharp intellect beneath. He had passed away from a sudden heart attack 1.5 years ago, a loss she still felt keenly. Her search returned dozens of emails. She scrolled through them, a nostalgic ache in her chest. They were filled with discussions of obscure texts, debates over etymology, and his encouraging feedback on her essays. Then she found it. An email chain from 3 years ago. Subject: that little project of mine. From Alistair Finch, afinchacam.se UK to Clara Hayes, chesacam, UK. My dear Clara, I hope your term is progressing well. I wanted to pick your brilliant brain on a matter of some personal excitement. I've finally decided to move forward with the manuscript I've been tinkering with for the better part of a decade. It's a historical thriller of all things. A departure from my usual academic fare, I know, but the story has taken hold of me. I'm calling it The Crimson Labyrinth. It's set in 17th century Prague and revolves around a reclusive cartographer, a lost manuscript, and the court of Rudolph II. It's a bit of a maze, both literally and figuratively. I've attached the first 3 chapters. I know how busy you are, but if you could find a spare moment to cast your expert eye over them, I would be eternally grateful. You have such an uncanny instinct for narrative structure. Warmly, Alistair. Clara's breath hitched. Her hand trembled as she double-clicked the attachment. A Word document yellowed with digital age opened on her screen. The Crimson Labyrinth by Alistair Finch. She read the first page, and then the second, and then the whole 50 pages he had sent her. The prose was unmistakable. It was Alistair's voice, erudite, intricate, and deeply evocative. The story of the lonely cartographer Jakob, his obsession with a mythical map, the descriptions of the alchemical workshops of Prague. It all came rushing back to her. She remembered sitting in a cafe, scribbling notes in the margins, captivated by the world he had created. She frantically searched for her reply in the email chain. From Clara Hayes, chesacam, UK, to Alistair Finch, afinchacam, UK professor. It's more than brilliant. It's a masterpiece. The voice is so unique, and the way you weave in the historical detail is breathtaking. Jakob's journey into his own obsession is a labyrinth in itself. I was completely captivated. My only note is a small one on pacing in Chapter 2. They had exchanged several more emails about it. He had been so passionate, so alive with the thrill of creation. He had told her he was nearing completion and was planning to seek an agent. That was the last they had spoken of it, before her world had been upended by the accident. Or now Elias Vance, a man of immense power and questionable morals, was championing a book with the exact same title. It couldn't be a coincidence. The title was too specific, too poetic. A cold, horrifying certainty began to crystallize in her mind. Elias Vance hadn't just discovered a new author. He had discovered a dead one. She opened a new browser tab and typed Elias Vance, The Crimson Labyrinth into the search bar. The results flooded the screen. Press releases from Vance and Sterling, interviews with Elias in literary journals. He spoke of the book with a proprietary reverence. It's a project I've been developing for some time, he was quoted in one article. The manuscript came to me through an estate sale, a forgotten work from an unknown author. I knew the moment I read the first page that it was something special. I've spent the last year polishing it, bringing the author's vision to life. I see it as my personal legacy, polishing it, bringing the vision to life. The lies were so audacious, so brazen. He had stolen it. He had taken Alistair's life's work, the product of a decade of quiet, brilliant labor, and was planning to pass it off as his own discovery, or worse, his own creation. He was a vulture picking at the bones of a dead man's legacy, and the detail about the estate sale was the final damning piece. After Professor Finch's death with no immediate family, his belongings, including his papers and his computer, would have been auctioned off. A man like Elias Vance, with his network of scouts and endless resources, could easily have acquired them. The confrontation at the restaurant was no longer just about her wounded pride. It was about justice for Alistair. He had been her mentor, her friend. He had believed in her when she hadn't believed in herself. She couldn't let this happen. Her fear from earlier was gone, burned away by a righteous, white-hot anger. Elias Vance had made a critical mistake. In his arrogance, he had mocked a simple waitress, never imagining that he was speaking to the one person in the world who could connect his masterpiece to the gentle, unassuming professor he had robbed. He had picked a fight with a ghost, but now he was going to have to deal with her. Clara saved a copy of the email and the manuscript chapters to a secure flash drive. She didn't have a plan yet, but she had something more important, the truth. And she would not rest until the entire world knew who the real author of The Crimson Labyrinth was. The call came the next morning, as expected. It wasn't Mr. Dubois, but his superior, the regional director of operations. The voice on the other end was cold and impersonal. Clara Hayes, this is to inform you that, due to a serious guest complaint involving a breach of our code of conduct, your employment with Ethelgards is terminated effective immediately. There was no discussion, no opportunity to defend herself. She was simply erased. The power of Elias Vance reached far and wide. Clara hung up the phone, a strange sense of calm settling over her. Losing her job should have been terrifying, and it was on a practical level. The rent was due, and Lily's medical fund was a hungry beast that always needed feeding. But on a deeper level it was liberating. He had taken her job, her only source of stability. He had left her with nothing left to lose. And a person with nothing to lose is a person you should fear. Her first move was not one of aggression, but of reconnaissance. She couldn't fight Elias Vance head-on. He was a fortress, surrounded by lawyers and publicists, but every fortress has a weak point. For Elias, she suspected it was Julian Croft. She remembered the look on Julian's face during the confrontation, not the blind loyalty of a sycophant, but the weary resignation of a man who had seen this behavior before. He had been uncomfortable with Elias's cruelty. He was the chink in the armor. Finding him was surprisingly easy. A quick search revealed he was speaking on a panel about the future of digital publishing at a downtown conference hotel that very afternoon. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one she had. She put on the nicest blazer she owned, a thrift store find, and took the bus downtown. The hotel lobby buzzed with industry professionals, all wearing laminated badges and expressions of networking-fueled ambition. Blending in was easy. She slipped into the back of the conference room just as the panel was beginning. There he was, sitting on the stage between a tech CEO and a best-selling author. He looked tired, his answers to the moderator's questions polished but lacking conviction. He looked like a man going through the motions. Clara waited. She listened to him speak about market synergy and branding strategy, all the while clutching the flash drive in her pocket like a talisman. When the panel ended, she positioned herself near the exit, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. As people swarmed the panelists, Julian made a swift exit through a side door, clearly trying to avoid the glad-handing. Clara followed him. She found him in a quiet hallway, leaning against the wall, loosening his tie as if it were a noose. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice steady. He spun around, startled. Recognition dawned on his face, followed by a wave of alarm. "You," he breathed. "What are you doing here? You can't be here." "I lost my job this morning," she said, cutting straight to the point. "I assume I have your boss to thank for that." Julian winced. "Look, I'm sorry about what happened. Elias was out of line. But you have to understand, you can't win a fight against him." "I'm not trying to win a fight," Clara replied, her gaze unwavering. "I'm trying to correct a lie. I'm talking about the Crimson Labyrinth." The name hit him like a physical blow. The color drained from his face. He looked up and down the empty hallway, his paranoia palpable. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Clara took a step closer. "It's a wonderful book, intricate atmospheric, the story of a 17th century cartographer named Jacob, set in Prague. A masterpiece, really. The author must be a true genius." Julian was silent, his jaw tight. "The thing is," Clara continued, her voice low and intense, "I know the author. His name was Alistair Finch. He was my professor at Cambridge. He sent me the first 3 chapters 3 years ago. I have the emails. I have the original draft." She held up the small flash drive. "It's all right here." Julian stared at the flash drive as if it were a venomous snake. The carefully constructed wall of his corporate loyalty was crumbling before her eyes. "Professor Finch died of a heart attack a year and a half ago." Clara pressed on. "His belongings were sold at an estate auction. Is that when Elias found it? When he found a dead man's life's work and decided to claim it as his own? You need to leave." Julian whispered, his voice hoarse. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Elias is not someone you cross." "He already crossed me," Clara shot back. "And more importantly, he crossed my friend. Alistair was a good man. He deserves better than to have his legacy stolen by a plagiarist and a bully." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, guilt-shame, perhaps even a sliver of admiration. She had reached him. "Think about it, Mr. Croft," she said, taking one last gamble. "Elias is building his personal legacy on a foundation of lies. How long do you think that can last before it all comes crashing down? And where will you be when it does? Standing in the rubble next to him?" She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the sterile hallway, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She didn't know if she had succeeded, if she had planted a seed of doubt or simply painted a target on her back. Meanwhile, at the opulent headquarters of Vance and Sterling Publishing, Elias Vance wasn't celebrating his victory. He was stewing in a state of agitated fury. The waitress's words echoed in his mind, not just her insults, but her intelligence. She wasn't some nobody. She was educated, articulate, and worst of all, she was fearless. She was a loose end, and Elias Vance hated loose ends. "Find out everything about her," he snarled at his head of security over the phone. "Clara Hayes, former waitress at Ethelgard's. I want to know where she lives, who her family is, where she went to school. I want to know every skeleton in her closet. I want to know what gives her the right to exist." He was a man accustomed to control, and for a terrifying moment in that restaurant, he had lost it completely. He was determined to get it back, to crush this insignificant woman who had dared to challenge him. But in his paranoid rage, he failed to notice the growing unease in his right-hand man. He failed to see that the ripple effect from that one shattered evening was already beginning to erode the very foundations of his empire. For 2 days Clara heard nothing. The silence was unnerving. She spent the time frantically applying for any job she could find, bookstores, cafes, tutoring centers, while the dwindling numbers in her bank account mocked her. The fear was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of her anger. Had she pushed too hard? Had Julian simply reported her to Elias? Was a team of high-priced lawyers at that very moment drafting a cease-and-desist letter designed to ruin her? Then, late on the 3rd night, an email arrived from an encrypted anonymous address. The message was short and chilling. "They're watching you. He has people looking into your sister. Be careful. If you still want to talk, meet me tomorrow. 10 p.m. The old pier at the waterfront. Come alone." There was no signature, but she knew who it was from. "He has people looking into your sister." The word sent a shard of ice through her heart. This had gone beyond a literary theft. Elias was now targeting the one person she had in the world. He was threatening Lily. The line had been crossed. Her resolve hardened from anger into pure, unadulterated steel. The next night, a cold wind whipped in off the river, carrying the smell of salt and decay. The old pier was deserted, its rotting planks creaking under her feet with every step. Silhouetted against the distant city lights stood a single figure. It was Julian Croft. He looked even more haggard than he had at the conference. His expensive suit rumpled his face, pale in the dim light. "You came," he said, his voice tight with anxiety. "He's investigating my sister," Clara said, dispensing with pleasantries. "A 12-year-old girl in a wheelchair." Julian flinched, unable to meet her gaze. "I told him to stop. I told him he was going too far, but he's not listening. He's spiraling. He's obsessed with silencing you." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. "You were right about everything. I need to make it right." Clara remained guarded. Why help me now? What's in it for you?" He let out a bitter, self-deprecating laugh. "What's in it for me? Maybe a single night of sleep where I don't feel like a complete fraud. I got into publishing because I loved books, because I believed in the power of stories. Now I just enable a monster." He paced the length of the pier, his words spilling out in a torrent of guilt and confession. "I was there when the manuscript came in. It was part of a lot from a Cambridge professor's estate. Elias read it and became obsessed. He said it was perfect, a lost masterpiece. At first, the plan was just to publish it, posthumously give the author full credit." "What changed?" Clara asked, her voice quiet. Julian stopped pacing and faced her. Elias changed. The book became his. He started editing it, changing passages, inserting his own metaphors. He convinced himself that he was finishing it, that his touch was what made it truly great. He built this whole narrative around himself as its discoverer and savior. The deeper he got, the more he needed to erase the real author completely. The man's name became a forbidden word in the office. The story was even uglier than she had imagined. It wasn't just theft, it was a complete narcissistic desecration of Alistair's work. "There's more," Julian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Something that has never sat right with me. The Professor Alistair Finch. The official report said he died of a massive coronary event. He was found in his study. But I saw the full acquisitions report from the estate handlers. There were inconsistencies. A broken lamp, a dislodged bookshelf. The paramedics' initial notes mentioned signs of a struggle before the official cause of death was determined." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Elias was in Cambridge that week." Julian set his eyes wide with the horror of his own implication. He flew out on the company jet for a meeting that was never on his official calendar. The day before, Professor Finch was found dead. I don't have proof, nothing concrete. But Elias is capable of anything when he wants something. And he wanted that manuscript more than anything I've ever seen. The air grew heavy and cold. This was no longer a story of plagiarism. It was potentially a story of murder. Alistair, the kind, gentle man who had written to her about his passion project, might have been killed for his words. Clara's mission had changed. This wasn't just about restoring a man's name to his book. It was about getting justice for his life. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly, but her resolve clear. She and Julian were no longer adversaries. They were allies, bound by a dark and dangerous secret. Julian pulled a folder from his briefcase. "The book launches in 2 days. It's a massive gala at the City Modern Art Museum. The press, the critics, investors, everyone will be there. It's supposed to be his coronation." He handed her the folder. Inside was an invitation, a floor plan of the museum, and a schedule of events. He's going to give a speech. He's going to read the first chapter aloud. He thinks it will be his moment of ultimate triumph. And that's when we expose him. Clara finished a plan beginning to form in the chaos of her mind. A cold, audacious, and incredibly risky plan. "He won't see it coming," Julian said. "He'll be surrounded by his adoring public, insulated by his own arrogance. He'll never expect the waitress he had fired to be there, waiting to tear it all down." Clara looked at the invitation in her hand. It was her ticket into the lion's den. Elias had tried to crush her to make her invisible, but he was about to learn that the most dangerous opponent is the one you've already dismissed. She wasn't just fighting for a manuscript anymore. She was fighting for Alistair's life and for the soul of every story that had ever been silenced. The City Modern Art Museum was a cathedral of glass and steel, its cavernous main hall transformed into a shrine for Elias Vance's ego. Champagne flutes clinked, a string quartet played something modern and dissonant, and the city's cultural elite mingled under vast, abstract paintings. Projectors cast the cover of the Crimson Labyrinth, an intricate blood-red maze, onto the white marble walls. The air was thick with sycophantic praise and the scent of expensive perfume. At the center of it all stood Elias, holding court like a king. He was radiant with triumph, his fiancée Catherine clinging to his arm, her smile as dazzling and brittle as the diamonds around her neck. He accepted congratulations, his eyes sweeping the room, confident that every person there was an admirer, a subject in his kingdom. He did not notice the woman standing near the back, partially obscured by a brutalist sculpture. He would not have recognized her anyway. Clara Hayes was no longer in her waitress uniform. Using the last of her emergency funds, she had bought a simple, elegant dark blue dress. Her hair was down, styled in soft waves. She wore subtle makeup that highlighted the fierce intelligence in her eyes. She was not Clara the servant. She was Clara the scholar, the keeper of a truth that was about to ignite this tinderbox of vanity and lies. Julian had arranged for her invitation and a press pass from a small, independent literary blog, giving her a legitimate reason to be there. He stood across the room near the stage, giving her a barely perceptible nod. The plan was set. It was terrifyingly simple and could go wrong in 1,000 different ways. After an hour of mingling, Julian stepped up to the microphone on the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention." A hush fell over the crowd. "It gives me immense pleasure to introduce a man whose vision has redefined modern publishing, the driving force behind Vance and Sterling, and the man who has brought a lost masterpiece to light. Please welcome Elias Vance." Elias strode onto the stage to thunderous applause. He beamed, soaking in the adoration. He took his place at the polished lectern, a leather-bound copy of the book in his hands. "Thank you, Julian. Thank you all for being here." He began, his voice smooth and commanding. "A story is a living thing. Sometimes it is born into the world with a loud, clear voice. Other times it lies dormant, a seed, waiting for the right person to come along and give it sunlight and water. So it was with The Crimson Labyrinth." Clara felt a nauseous wave of revulsion. He was painting himself as a nurturer, a creator. "When I first held the raw, forgotten pages of this manuscript," he continued, his voice dripping with false humility, "I felt a connection, a sacred duty to its unknown author. I spent a year living inside this world, polishing each sentence, ensuring that the voice you hear tonight is as powerful as it was always meant to be. This book is more than a publication. It is a resurrection." He opened the book. "I'd like to read you the opening paragraph." The room was silent, captivated. Elias cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on the page. This was his moment. "The city of Prague," he began to read, "is a puzzle box of cobblestone and sorrow, and Jakob, its most devoted cartographer, was a man made of locked rooms." He read the first 2 sentences. Before he could start the third, a voice, calm and clear, cut through the hall from the back. "Excuse me, Mr. Vance." Every head turned. Clara stepped out from behind the sculpture. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Who was this woman? Elias looked up, his eyes narrowing in confusion. He didn't recognize her at first. "I'm sorry, we'll be taking questions after the reading." "This isn't a question," Clara said, taking a few steps forward, her press pass visible. "It's a point of clarification. For the author." Elias's face tightened as recognition finally dawned. A flash of pure, unadulterated rage, quickly masked by a condescending smile. "Ah, the literary critic from Ethelgard's, wasn't it? I'm afraid you're a little out of your depth here." Some in the crowd snickered, siding with power. "On the contrary," Clara said, her voice amplified by the room's acoustics, "I feel I'm uniquely qualified to comment on this particular work, especially that opening line." She turned her address to the audience. "It's a beautiful line, isn't it? Jakob was a man made of locked rooms. It so perfectly captures the character's essence." She then looked directly at Elias. "And it's almost as he wrote it." But not quite. The original draft the one Professor Alistair Finch sent me on October 12th, 3 years ago, read slightly differently. It read, "Jakob was a man built of locked rooms." Built, Mr. Vance, not made. It implies intention. It suggests he constructed his own prison. A subtle difference, but a crucial one. Wouldn't you agree? For a man who claims to have polished every sentence, it's a curious change to make, one that slightly weakens the author's original intent. The room was now dead silent. The press members, smelling blood in the water, began to raise their phones, their cameras. Catherine's smile had vanished, replaced by a look of utter confusion. Elias's face was a stone mask. "I have no idea what you're talking about. This is a pathetic attempt to grab attention." "Is it?" Clara took another step. "Let's turn to page 87, shall we, where Jakob discovers the flaw in the celestial map. You describe the ink as bleeding like a fresh wound. A powerful, if somewhat cliché, simile. But Professor Finch's original draft, which I have right here," she held up her phone, an image of the Word document displayed on its screen, describes it as the ink spidering into a new, unwanted geography. It's a cartographer's metaphor, you see. It's authentic. It's better. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder. People were looking at each other, then at Elias, whose composure was visibly cracking. "This is absurd." He spat his voice, losing its smooth veneer. "Security, remove this woman." But before any security guard could move, Julian Croft stepped forward from the side of the stage. "No," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "Let her speak." Elias shot Julian a look of pure venom. The betrayal was absolute. Clara now had the entire room's undivided attention. She walked slowly towards the stage, her gaze locked on Elias. "You call the author unknown," she said, her voice ringing with emotion. "His name was Alistair Finch. He was a brilliant, kind man, a scholar and a storyteller. He was my friend. And you didn't just steal his book, you erased him. You desecrated his memory." She was standing at the foot of the stage now, looking up at him. "And I have one final question, Mr. Vance. You claim you found his manuscript at an estate sale after he died. But company records show your private jet was parked at the Cambridge airport for 48 hours, ending the morning Professor Finch's body was discovered. What was that meeting about, Mr. Vance? Did you try to buy the manuscript from him first? Did he refuse? What happened in that study? What did the paramedics really see before the official report was written?" The final accusation hung in the air, monstrous and undeniable. Catherine Davenport gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she took a step away from Elias. The cameras were flashing incessantly, now a volley of silent explosions. Elias Vance stood trapped in the spotlight, the leather-bound book of lies still in his hand. The narrative he had so carefully constructed had been ripped to shreds. The king was naked on his stage, and the ghost of a forgotten professor, given voice by a waitress he had mocked, had come to claim her justice. His empire of words had been brought down by a few simple truths. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The gala ended not with applause, but with the frantic shouting of reporters and the stunned, hurried exit of the city's elite. Elias Vance was swarmed, his face a grotesque mask of fury and panic as he was bundled away by his security team. The video of Clara's calm, methodical demolition of his character went viral before the night was even over. The next morning, the headlines were brutal. "Publishing titan accused of plagiarism, foul play. The Waitress and the CEO Vance and Sterling empire crumbles. Death of Cambridge professor re-examined." The story was a perfect storm, a tale of hubris and deceit, a David and Goliath narrative with a dark, potentially murderous twist. The police in Cambridge, prompted by the international media frenzy and a formal statement from Julian Croft, officially reopened the investigation into Alistair Finch's death. Elias Vance's world collapsed with breathtaking speed. The board of Vance and Sterling forced his immediate resignation. His fiancée Catherine Davenport, whose family valued reputation above all else, broke off their engagement via a sterile press release. He was engulfed in a maelstrom of lawsuits from Alistair Finch's distant relatives, who had emerged from the woodwork from shareholders and from authors whose careers he had built on a foundation of lies. The king had been dethroned and cast out of his own kingdom. In the midst of the chaos, Julian Croft, now the acting CEO, made his first official act. He held a press conference. He announced that the Crimson Labyrinth would be published in its original, unedited form, with full and sole authorship credited to Professor Alistair Finch. All profits past and future would be placed in a trust to fund a new scholarship in Finch's name at Cambridge for underprivileged students of literature. It was an act of penance and a promise of a new, more ethical future for the company. A few weeks later, long after the media storm had moved on to its next victim, Clara sat in a quiet corner of a neighborhood cafe, a place with worn wooden tables and the comforting smell of coffee and old books. The frantic pace of her life had finally slowed. She had her old job back, not at Ethelgard's, but at a cozy local bookstore, a place where she belonged. The tips were smaller, but the smiles were genuine. The bell above the door chimed, and Julian Croft walked in. He looked different. The haunted, anxious energy was gone, replaced by a quiet gravitas. "Clara," he said, sitting down across from her. "Mr. Croft," she replied with a small smile. "Or should I say Mr. CEO?" He grimaced slightly. "Julian, please. I just came to deliver this." He slid a large, beautifully printed book across the table. It was the finished copy of The Crimson Labyrinth. On the cover in elegant gold lettering were the words, "By Alistair Finch." Clara ran her fingers over the name, a lump forming in her throat. It was real. They had done it. "Thank you, Julian," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He would have loved this." "It's you who should be thanked," he said earnestly. "You did this. You had the courage to speak up when no one else would." He paused, then pushed another envelope across the table. "This is from the board. And from me. We're rebuilding Vance and Sterling from the ground up. We want to fill it with people who actually care about books, not just balance sheets. We need a new editorial team. People with integrity and a true eye for talent." Clara looked at him confused. "It's a job offer," he said. "Junior editor. It's not a corner office, but it's a start. A real salary. Health benefits that will cover everything Lily needs. You're the most qualified person I know." Clara stared at the envelope, then at the book, and finally at Julian. 2 years ago, her life had been a story of loss and survival, a chapter she thought would never end. But in the span of a few weeks, she had rewritten her own narrative. She had faced down a tyrant, honored her friend's memory, and in doing so found her way back to the world she had been forced to leave behind. Later that evening, she sat by Lily's bed, the lamp casting a warm glow on the room. Lily was awake, her bright, curious eyes fixed on the new book in Clara's hands. "What's that one?" Lily asked. "It's a story," Clara said, her voice soft. "It's about a man who searched for truth in old maps. It was written by a very dear friend of mine." She opened to the first page and began to read aloud Alistair Finch's words, filling the small apartment, no longer silenced, no longer stolen. They were free just as she was. The labyrinth had been solved, and a new unwritten chapter was waiting just for her. Clara's story is a powerful reminder that arrogance and power are no match for the truth. It shows us that behind every uniform, every name tag, there is a person with a history, with skills, and with a strength you might never expect. The battle between Elias's arrogance and Clara's quiet integrity reminds us that real power isn't about shouting the loudest, but about knowing the value of your own voice. It's a story of justice for the silenced, and a testament to the fact that one person armed with courage can indeed change the world, or at least bring a corrupt corner of it crashing down. If this story of justice and vindication resonated with you, if you believe in the power of the underdog and the ultimate triumph of truth, please hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own hidden strength. And don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories that remind us to never ever judge a book or a person by their cover.